Hi, I'm Academic Lead Developer RackForms. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the hints and tricks that I use to create full applications in RackForms. So to jump right in then, one of the first things that I make very heavy use of is the concept of code blocks. So if I have a page selected here and I scroll down to layout, you notice I can add a block. And a block is simply a region of code that in the editor displays as this nice cleanly delineated yellow background area. So it'll show by default the first two lines of code that we have, but anything after that it hides for us. And the main advantage here is that I can have lots of custom code in my page and I don't have to worry about cluttering up my preview right here. So in this particular case then, I have some, as we can see, HTML and even some inline PHP right here. This combines then with an area for inputting raw CSS code and optionally raw JavaScript code, such that when I run this job, I now display the HTML that I had in that block with, again, not having to junk up my area right here. Further to this, if I select my page right here, an option that you may not have used before is called page export mode. So what page export mode basically means is, by default, when I create a form page, it's set to full export. And if we think about what that means, it means that we're exporting everything that RackForms would need to create a full standalone page. So your HTML head block, your HTML open and close tags, etc. However, in cases like this, where I'm creating a navigation, I don't actually need to output all that, so I'd actually just junk up my other page code where I'm including that element. And so we have a couple different export modes. The most popular there are form fields only and PHP head code only. Now we're going to look at PHP head code only in a second job, but for right now, essentially I'm using form fields only, and as we can see here, there's a hint that says used for navigation and templating. So what this basically means is, when I run this job right here, I don't actually get an HTML open and close block. I only get the code that is in the main page area, which in this particular case is this code block. I take advantage of this fact then with the first really key concept of this video, which is I use a second code block to include this full page. So I want to create a navigation, but I don't want to have to write that navigation separate for each page. It's a very common thing in programming if we're doing it by hand, right? I need navigation, don't want to create it multiple times. I'll create it once and I'll include it in other pages. And that's exactly what we're doing right here. I created this page as navigation. I set its export mode to form fields only, so I don't include a bunch of junk. And then I include it in a second code block in all of the form pages here now in this job that actually need that navigation. So as we can see here now, if I run this page, here's my navigation, and then here's the content that goes along with that page. Now it doesn't actually stop there though. So here I'm using code blocks to basically include some custom PHP and HTML. I can also use code blocks to include other iframes from other pages in the job. So if I scroll down to this page right here, if I run this, you can see here that I have my first code block, which includes my navigation, and there it is. I then have some other text and a selected vendor, and then I have three code blocks right here. Well, as we could see, these three code blocks are actually including these three builder pages right here, right? So this guy, and this guy. So essentially what I've done is I've taken one page and I've composed it out of several other pages. Now, of course, the benefit to that is, as a user interface person, or so I should say somebody using this form, I now have this cool logic here where I can select a vendor, and I get this page to refresh that shows all the people that belong to these specific locations. Now, the way that we're actually handling that is the second big trick. So right here, my include was very simply PHP include nav.php, right? I'm just going to grab the nav.php page, and I'm going to include it into my form. These guys, though, are actually including iframes. Now, because I'm including iframes, I want all the code that RackForms use to build these pages as standalone entities, right? So I want to include all of the head code, etc., because it's going to be wrapped in an iframe anyway. The key, though, is that when I actually select this guy right here, I took the embed code raw from right here, and then I appended to it this right here, vendor ID equals F, which means a token for a form field, select a vendor. So I include the page. I then put my query string vendor ID equals F select a vendor. Well, this is the select a vendor form field right here, which means that if I, in this case, include an onChange event right here that says, as soon as I change this element, submit the form. Well, because I've now selected a vendor and because I've submitted the form, well, that means that I now have a form field value called select a vendor. And that select a vendor value then can be used as a query string parameter to my code block right here. Now, the way this all ties together is I know that I'm passing this iframe right here for Fairfax Nursing Center a get string called select a vendor that's equal to the value that I've selected right here. I use that then in my repeater SQL as this right here. So I say select some information from this database table, and I'm going to say the vendor ID is equal to G vendor ID. So G vendor ID means the get string called vendor ID. Recall that we're creating the get string right here. So now between that really simple bit of logic right there, I select a vendor. I now have passed in a get string to each one of these iframes, and the get string is then picked up by the repeater SQL block and executed. As you can see here, they coordinate beautifully. Finally, the last thing I want to look at then is just this very simple idea of the query module. Now, if you've been using RackForms for a little bit of time for application-like work or doing more advanced form features like pre-filling fields, you've probably already used the query module before. But if you haven't, the basic idea is the query module allows us to query a database at any time and then use the results for that in any way that we please. In this particular case, I'm querying a database to vendor main contact name and username from this HC login table, where the ID equals, once again, that form field value from select a vendor. So the user selects a vendor. When we refresh this page then, it goes in and says, right, grab the form field value from select a vendor and use that as the ID parameter to this query. I then use the result of this query right here. You'll see it's query a database to $Q1 right here. So I say, grab the username and vendor main contact name from these form fields. Now I can type this in by hand, or I can use the advanced token picker right here. The end result though is that when I run this form, if there's a matching vendor and main contact person name for that vendor in the database, it will display it for us. And again, here I'm actually using this to populate a static form field, but I could just as easily populate, static display element, but I could just as easily use it to display form fields, right? Pre-population. So between these techniques right here, code blocks to include pages and include iframes, using some cool tricks right here to append query strings to iframe source code, we could do some really powerful things. Finally, the last real main use of using iframes is to create an automatically updated list. So in this particular page of the job right here, I once again include the nav block, but then I also have this iframe right here. Now you notice this iframe right here doesn't actually include a query string. It simply says grab the employee list.php page, and the employee list is this guy right here. Now this guy is actually using a session element to query off a vendor ID. Now the reason why we did that is because when you log into this application, you're going to be a vendor that has a specific ID tied to your user account. We don't want you to ever have access to or change that. So we actually hard code that right here. We say, right, your vendor ID is the only vendor's information that you're going to see. So we don't actually use a dynamic query right here, but we do use this employee list table right here embedded into this page to create some really neat logic. So what I mean by that is if I save, you can see here that the vendor employee list right here is simply displaying all employees that belong to this vendor. And I can go through and I can update my records, set which properties they belong to, etc. But here's where the really neat thing comes in. If I add a sample user, let's just call him sample, and I set him to, let's say, the gardens, and hit submit employee record, basically what happens is this. I submit this page, and because a form field automatically reloads itself when I submit a page, this iframe's contents are automatically going to be refreshed as well. And because this iframe's content is based off of the session ID for this employer right here, this list is automatically going to redraw down here with this newest record that I've added. And we can see it does that right now. I'll submit the employee record, And if I scroll down, here is sample sample added to our database. And again, of course, I can do other things like delete records and so on. Finally, the last thing I wanted to really briefly look at is a single page application. So of course what we've been looking at right here is something where a user can essentially click around and access different parts of an application from one main job in RackForms. That doesn't mean, however, that we can't create everything and just bundle it into a single page as far as the user is concerned. And that's what this job does right here. So I'm not going to get too deep into this, but the basic idea with this job was that if you had advertised on Google AdWords and you had visitors visiting your site, it used to be, fortunately it doesn't do this anymore, but it used to be that the refer information from that request would be given to you so that you could see what keywords brought that user to your page from your AdWords account. Again, unfortunately, Google doesn't provide this anymore, so this application really isn't useful, but the concept is still the same in that it is a single page application. So basically what we have right here is a couple iframes and, a couple embedded code sections right here in code blocks. So you can see here that once again we're including PHP, we're creating timelines, etc. This code really here can be anything that we want. And we're going to see when we run this job right here just how complex it can be. We also have a file manager right here. So in this case, we're actually simply using some of the native controls that RackForms has to drive this single page application. So in this case, a file uploader. And as you'll see right here, we even have a custom HTML5 uploader that we put in. And then finally, and this is really key right here, we also have some PHP includes. So basically, in that first job, you saw that I used the kind of like a standalone form page to draw some HTML for a navigation element. Well, one of the other ways that I very commonly use a separate page for code is in the PHP top code block. So if I click this guy right here, you'll notice now that I have some PHP code in this guy, I have PHP code in this guy, and each one of these blocks performs its own separate function. So here I have a log parser, here I have a data processor, here I can see that this is obviously called with Ajax, and so on. So the basic idea then is this PHP code right here that's written is only performing a very specific function for the rest of my single page application. Therefore, as you may recall with the first job, I set the page export mode for my navigation element to form fields only. Well, in this case, I set its page export mode to PHP head code only. In other words, when I run this page right here, I don't want anything to display because the only code that's actually doing something is in the PHP top code block. So you can see here the source code for this page is completely blank, but I know it's doing something because its PHP head code block has something. And therefore, when I actually call that code later on in this right here, when I create a new Apache log processor and I actually use this code, essentially what I've done is I've created this really nice separation of duties in my application within RackForms. In other words, I don't want to have to mix my Apache log parser code with my data processor or my Ajax call logic right here. I want to keep it separate. Now usually if I was coding this by hand, I would simply create a different page that was called Apache log parser.php. And essentially, that's exactly what we're doing in RackForms. I don't want to mix that code up. I want to keep it simple. So I simply create a new form page in RackForms. I set its export mode to PHP head code, and therefore I now have this really clean separation of duties in my job. Anyway, with all that said, let's take a look at what this looks like. You can see right here that I have this really cool interface. And what essentially I used to do is any of the clicks that I had for my AdWords account, it would show right here, along with some information in little bubble format of what that click was and its keywords. We can also, again, upload files right here or even drag and drop log files onto this. The last thing I wanted to very quickly look at is these guys right here. So one of the things that we often need to do in applications is have things span pages or have different alignments. And so RackForms, very easy to do. So for this guy right here, I sent its field width to 100%. And that's why it spans the entire width of the page, simple as that. And for this guy, we get him to stick to the right edge of the page by simply saying element position is equal to right with a 30 pixel margin. And simply by setting that, we now get that to stick to the side of the page without us having to write any funky CSS or table code to make that happen. And so that's our basic tour then of building applications in RackForms. Obviously there's a lot here, but what I really wanted to impress upon you in this video was these core concepts of using code blocks in your pages and separating duty using individual pages right here, so that everything has the same appearance of an application, but it's all done within one job within RackForms. Of course, if you have any questions about this or anything else that you see in RackForms, always happy to help. Please let us know at info@rackforms.com, and thanks for watching.